So, my name is Jeffrey Thane. A bit of background, I spent the past decade blogging at Latter-day Saint Philosopher. This is a website that I created in 2008 with my friend Nathan Richardson. Um, we created the website to be a place where we and others can explore the realm of philosophy, psychology, and other subjects through the lens of revealed truth. That is from a distinctly Latter-day Saint perspective. This is one of several, or the first of several presentations that I'm considering going live with and recording and posting to the website. This is the first time I've done this, so bear with me. I may have some technology issues, but let's see how it goes. Today's presentation is called, "What is the Main Plot of Your Life? A Writer's Guide to Gospel Living." Some of you may know me, and some of you don't, but many of you may ask, why is Jeff qualified to do a presentation entitled A Writer's Guide to Gospel Living? So yeah, some of you may ask, why is Jeff qualified to do a presentation entitled A Writer's Guide to Gospel Living? I'm talking about drawing insights from fiction writing here, and truthfully, I've never actually published fiction before, but I've dabbled in fiction writing, and I've made them a long and deep study of the themes involved in the stories that I read and watch. But most importantly, I believe that we are all co-authors of our own life story. And this means understanding our lives from a literary perspective can be immensely helpful. Let me share with you an example of a narrative template that we can find in speculative fiction, such as science fiction or fantasy. For those who are familiar with this narrative template that I'm going to describe here, know that I'm oversimplifying the details for the sake of this presentation. These stories often take place in three stages. The first stage is what many call the departure. The protagonist of the story starts off in a familiar setting. They may be happy there or they might not, but it's home to them because it's familiar. Then they encounter a call to adventure. For example, Gandalf might rap on the door. A letter is delivered by an owl. Luke discovers Leia's recording on R2-D2, for example. These are all examples of a call to adventure. Next, you might see the refusal of the call. The protagonist is often reluctant to accept the call to adventure. Bilbo is at first reluctant to go off the doors, or that might be by proxy. Uncle Dudley hides the letters from Harry to try to keep him from going. And then we might have the meeting of the mentor. Once the protagonist accepts the call to adventure, they encounter a mentor who will guide them, and they will also encounter relics or tools that will assist them along the way. Bilbo, for example, has Gandalf, and is soon given a sword called Sting, and eventually a magic ring. Harry has Dumbledore, and gets a wand and an owl. Luke has Obi-Wan Kenobi, and soon gets a lightsaber. The next stage is called the initiation. It's called this because it's the protagonist's initiation into the world of the unfamiliar. It's Bilbo's grand adventure. It's Harry discovering the world of magic. It's Luke being thrust into an intergalactic battle. Lots of things can happen during this stage of the story, and I'll just discuss just three. We might see the road of trials. The protagonist is tested somehow through a series of encounters with enemies or hardships that test various aspects of their skill and character. They may fail at these, or they may succeed. Bilbo finds himself battling wits with trolls, and then in a cave of goblins, and then in a riddle contest, and then in a tussle with wolves, and then in a forest fighting spiders, and so forth. Luke and his friends are sucked into the Death Star and must escape. These are examples of the road of trials. Then we might see the apotheosis. The protagonist eventually has a grand realization or learns a new skill that prepares them for what's ahead. Bilbo learns his courage. Luke learns to trust the Force. Harry learns to use magic and rely on his friends. And then we might see the ultimate boon, where the protagonist must complete a task that only they can complete. Bilbo must face the dragon, or Frodo must destroy the ring. Harry must confront Voldemort. Luke must destroy the Death Star. And finally, we have what is called the return. This can be considered the denouement of the story. For those unfamiliar with the term, This refers to the part of the movie or a book after the climax, which wraps up the emotional arcs of the story. Lots can happen here, and here are 3 examples. You might see the refusal of the return. The protagonist might be reluctant to return to their old world. Bilbo is uncertain whether he wants to return to domestic life at the Shire. Harry doesn't look forward to living with the Dudleys again, and so forth. You might see the Master of Two Worlds, where the protagonist now straddles the 2 realms. Harry is now a wizard living in a Muggle family. Luke is now learning the ways of a Jedi. Bilbo is now filled with wanderlust and memories of grand adventure while fending off relatives at the Shire. And then lastly, you have the freedom to live. Now that a hero's journey is complete, the protagonist is free to live. Harry, for example, now has something to look forward to in the fall, and life is worth living again. Luke is no longer trapped in the drudgeries of farm life. Samwise the Brave can marry and have children, and Frodo can rest from his burdens of carrying the ring. This template is often referred to as the hero's journey. It represents a meta-narrative, and is sometimes referred to as a monomyth. All great stories, adventures, epics, and myths, some claim, are echoes of this monomyth, variations on this theme. What's interesting is that the author of these stories rarely realize they're following this template. It's a narrative that sets forth our expectations for the story without us ever realizing it. And this leads me to my first point. Invisible templates can guide literary stories and narratives. Writers will often follow these story beats, these narrative stages, without any conscious forethought. But how can we follow writing conventions that are invisible? Let's start with an example from grammar. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, that's J.R.R. Tolkien, if any of you are ever wondering what his full name was, wrote his first story at age 7. It was about a green great dragon. He showed it to his mother, who told him that you absolutely couldn't have a green great dragon, and that it had to be a great green one instead. Tolkien was so disheartened that he never wrote another story for years. The reason for Tolkien's mistake, since you ask, is that adjectives in English absolutely have to be in this order: opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, noun. So you can have a lovely little old rectangular green French silver whittling knife. But if you mess with that word order in the slightest, you'll sound like a maniac. It's an odd thing that every English speaker uses that list, but almost none of us could write it out. And as size comes before color, green great dragons can't exist. This is an excerpt from a book by a journalist named Mark Forsyth, and I think that yields a lot of insight into how invisible norms can guide our actions. Think of this: most of us instinctively use this list when speaking and writing, but few of us even know about it. It's an invisible convention that guides our speech, and yet most of us could never put it into words. If invisible conventions of grammar can determine the next word in a string of adjectives, it makes sense that an invisible grammar of storytelling can set our expectations for what comes next in a story. In a similar way, social norms are often invisible, unstated, and yet they guide our behavior on a day-to-day basis. The next time you step into an elevator, stand facing away from the doors, and you'll notice that everyone else in the elevator will feel deeply uncomfortable. It's a convention that we all follow, and yet it's unstated and invisible to most of us. There's thousands of norms like this that influence our day-to-day actions. And this leads me to our next point. Invisible social scripts and narratives can shape our expectations for what comes next in the screenplay of our own lives. Most of us are not consciously aware of these, yet they guide our actions, decisions, expectations, hopes, and disappointments. In some ways, it can be compared to us all building houses using a common set of blueprints that we aren't aware of. Let me talk about a handful of these. So in the first narrative, the protagonist of the story, and to be clear, I'm talking about people like you and me, pursue an education. Lots of things can happen here. For example, we can choose a major. We can decide whether to study astronomy or economics or history or engineering. We can also party and play. We can make friends and develop camaraderie in a college environment. And we finish off this stage of our story by getting a degree. The next stage of the narrative is our career. We first get a job, and then we climb the career ladder. At each rung, we increase our income, and thereby increase our discretionary spending so that we can eventually buy a house and become homeowners. And then eventually all that hard work comes to fruition with retirement, where we resign from our jobs and spend the rest of our days traveling the world and enjoying a life of relative leisure and rest. This narrative template is what I refer to as the consumerist narrative. Now, I want to be clear, it might be an unrealistic narrative for many people. Maybe it rarely plays out this way. And this is one of my points in a moment, actually. A narrative template doesn't have to be plausible in order to, in practice, in order to be widely embraced as an invisible ideal that we use to measure our lives. It can become a script that sets forth the next scenes of our life, the expected climax, and conclusion of our story. And in this way, this narrative can define our disappointments in life. Deviations from this norm come to feel like personal failure or failures of the system. Either we aren't good enough or the system isn't working for us. For example, a bad semester at school is devastating for those who implicitly embrace this narrative template for their lives. The same with unemployment or underemployment or chronic illness or bankruptcy, medical debt, or even premature death. There's nothing more devastating in this narrative template than premature death. All these things can derail our story and interrupt the narrative flow and curtail our success. I have family members whose college education was interrupted by chronic illness that more than a decade later still prevents them from attending school and pursuing their professional aspirations. I have a dear friend who passed away from cancer just after finishing his doctorate and landing a job that he loved. I have a coworker who retired and then passed away a couple months later. All of these things are devastating to those who treat the consumerist narrative as the main plot of their life. It's a bit like a videotape getting tangled in the VCR just before the climax of a movie, or a DVD with a huge scratch on it that keeps you from finishing the story, or a book with the last third of the pages ripped out. There's a variation on the consumerist narrative template. It follows the same major story beats as the consumerist template, but with some important additional dimensions. In this narrative template, the education stage must entail choosing a major that fits our passions and moves us towards our calling. This adds some disappointments and anxiety to our life story, as we fear making the wrong decisions that don't advance us to the designed end of our story. We fear that we'll end up in a dead end in our personal choose-your-own-adventure novel, for example. Then, in the career stage of the narrative, it becomes imperative that we find a profession that fulfills us and scratches all of our professional itches, and in which we can excel over our peers and thereby earn fame and fortune. This further defines some more major life disappointments, such as becoming a plumber instead of a star basketball player, or never making that big break as a musician, or having all of our entrepreneurial efforts be fruitless, or failing to get elected in our most important political race. And finally, all these things are, in this narrative, supposed to lead to a conclusion in which we enjoy the power, prestige, and accolades that come from a successful and influential career, as we use our wealth to advance our favorite humanitarian causes and our influence to advance our favorite social causes. The greatest disappointments in this narrative are that we find ourselves in the twilight of our years, having no resources or power at all, that find our voices no more influential than anybody else's. In other words, that we end our lives as a nobody, to be unnoticed in the annals of our community or nation. This is a variation of the consumerist narrative, and I think it can be referred to as the exceptionalist narrative. I'm still looking for better names for this one, but that's what I call it for now. So to recap, we discussed two different narrative templates, the consumerist narrative and the exceptionalist narrative. These are closely related to each other. So I'm going to explore another one that's going to be especially familiar to all of you. In this narrative, the protagonist works to prepare themselves to receive ordinances in the temple and to commence full-time missionary service. Once they're home, they'll find and marry an eternal companion. And then with that eternal companion, they'll raise children. And as they do, they'll be invited to serve in various church callings with growing responsibilities and stewardship. As first an elders quorum president, then bishop, then stake president, and eventually perhaps as a temple president or a mission president. I refer to this as the church narrative. Now, maybe be on record as saying that, with perhaps the exception of aspiring to bigger and better callings, nothing here is, or everything here, let me rephrase that, everything here is a noble aspiration, something we want to be a norm within our faith community. That said, I think we sometimes have this idea of how things are supposed to go. And any deviation from the template, once again, feels like either a personal failure or a systemic failure. Like the other templates, this narrative defines our disappointments and our discontents. For example, some people, for some reason or other, might be ineligible for full-time missionary service. Others might, often through no fault of their own, find the physical and emotional demands of a mission too overwhelming and find themselves returning early. Others might face the challenges of same-sex attraction. For a number of reasons, they and others might face the loneliness of being a middle-aged single within the church. Some couples face the heartbreak of infertility. Yet others might, despite their best efforts, find their marriage ending prematurely in divorce. And yet others might find themselves continually called to serve in the nursery, year after year after year after year, despite feeling like their talents are better used elsewhere. I have heard too many people experience these various trials and challenges and more, and interpret these deviations from the template as deep personal failings. They'll internalize those failings and conclude that they are broken in some way. Or they might feel treated as a failure external to them and conclude the gospel of Jesus Christ isn't working for me. What they mean by this is that despite their best efforts, they are struggling to move on to the next step in this narrative template, or some other template that looks like this. In short, they come to believe that either they have failed or the gospel has failed. I'm going to spoil the punchline here and say that this template, while it sets forth noble aspirations for our lives, is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so when this template fails, and it will fail in some way or another for all of us to some degree or another, it is not the gospel that is failing us, nor does it necessarily mean that we are failing either. Certainly, bad choices we make can undermine our best efforts to pursue noble ideals. But even if we make the best of all possible choices, we might find ourselves facing any or even all of these same disappointments. And I'll come back to more on that in a moment. So we discussed three major story templates for our lives. These three templates all have something in common. They center on events in our lives, things that we do or which happen to us. They are what we might call plot-driven stories. Let's talk about this for a moment. In plot-driven stories, the stories move forward by events and setting changes. Things happen to the characters as we move from one scene to the next, one set piece to another. In contrast, character-driven stories are moved forward by character choices and their relationships. The climax of a plot-driven story often centers on a big battle, a dramatic showdown, a character confrontation, or a grand reveal. In contrast, the climax of a character-driven story often centers on consequential character choice or character development. Let me give some examples to illustrate what I mean. Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark is a quintessential plot-driven story. Some have even observed that absolutely none of Indiana Jones' decisions play a consequential role in the outcome of the story. All of the main characters come out of the story basically unchanged. Another example might be almost any Mission Impossible movie, such as Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. In this thrilling story, once again, the story climax centers on a dramatic confrontation and fights, and all the characters lead the film basically as they were in the beginning. And finally, we have Jurassic Park. From set piece to set piece, the focus is on external threats that endanger the characters with very little, if any, significant change to the characters themselves. All right, and then finally, another film that is driven forward by plot and changes in set pieces is the first Iron Man film. In this movie, the climactic moment of the film is the physical confrontation between Tony Stark and his friend-turned-enemy Obadiah Stane, and the fate of the world hinges on his success in defeating Obadiah. Notice the questions that keep us on the edge of our seats. Does he find a treasure and keep it safe? Do they stop the terrorists and save the world? Do they survive? Does Tony stop the terrorists and those who supply them? Let's look at some character-driven stories for some contrast. One example is the Pixar movie Cars. The entire movie centers on the protagonist's development from a self-centered narcissist to a person of empathy and genuine concern for others. The climax of the story centers on a defining choice the character makes that marks a tremendous shift in who they are and what they value. Another Pixar favorite of mine is Inside Out, which explores a young girl grappling with the experience of loss and grief and experimenting with destructive ways of lashing out at those around her. The climax of the film is not some grand confrontation or big reveal, but it's the moment when Riley breaks down in tears and finally tells her parents how devastatingly sad she is. A TV series that is the epitome of character-driven storytelling is This Is Us. Almost all the stories in this series center on character developments and character moments. And then finally, another character-based film is once again the original Iron Man movie. This film is actually a great action film precisely because it balances its plot-driven story with tremendous character arcs. The narrative climax of the film is the grand battle at the end, but the emotional climax of the film is found in the myriads of moments in which Tony Stark is confronted with the consequences of his personal recklessness and arrogance, and where he sets aside self-concern and learns to take up a cause that is larger than himself. Let's look at the big questions that keep us on the edge of our seats. Does Lightning McQueen learn to put the needs of others above his own? Does Riley learn to embrace and express her grief? Do the Pearson brothers set aside their resentments and reconcile? Does Tony learn humility and accept responsibility for his mistakes? As I said before, each of the narrative templates we've discussed have one thing in common. They are plot-driven stories. They are distinguished from each other by what happens, that is, what we do or don't do in our lives. The landmarks and benchmarks that move us along the story are all events. Disappointments are defined when events do not unfold as we planned or expected. So I'm going to introduce two other templates that are, instead of plot-driven, are character-driven instead. Let's explore the first. Like most of the other templates, this story takes place in stages. The first stage is what I refer to as the oppressive community. The protagonist finds themselves in a community of norms that stifles their self-expression. This could be a small rural town that prohibits dancing. This could be a family and community that prohibits dating the person they love. This could be a culture that discourages rocket building in favor of coal mining. This could be a religious community that discourages embracing LGBT lifestyles. The next stage of the story is where the protagonist breaks free of their repressive past. I call it the personal liberation story. The protagonist finds the courage and fortitude to defy the norms of their community. This can be done either in secret or by leaving the community, or they're ostracized by the community. In the process, the protagonist embraces authenticity and self-expression and becomes a new person. They might find a new community of like-minded people that celebrates their differences and embraces their uniqueness and which shares their newfound values. And then finally, the last stage is where the protagonist returns, revisits, or reinvests in his prior community for the purpose of remaking the community's norms to accommodate their new worldviews and lifestyles. They seek reconciliation with the community by reinventing the community. This narrative template is what I refer to as the expressive individualist narrative, or just expressive individualism for short. Self-expression becomes the highest aspiration of the protagonist. We feel wistful, nostalgic almost, for a world that allows us to pursue our passions without relinquishing our various duties and obligations. This narrative can lead us to embrace a resentful attitude towards the duties of citizenship, family, and faith, when those things keep us from pursuing our deepest desires. If you've ever seen the movie October Sky, this is one of my favorite movies, and it is a pitch-perfect depiction of this narrative. Homer Hickam grows up in a small coal mining town where the expectation is that he will work in the coal mine. Homer takes interest in rocket building and decides he wants to be a rocket scientist. His father, who symbolically represents and embodies the community's stifling norms, disapproves. Eventually, Homer defies his father's wishes and participates in the regional science fair, and by so doing ostracizes himself from his father. The movie concludes when, through his son's example and goodwill, Homer's father has a change of heart and learns to celebrate his son's differing values and aspirations. Another example of this template is the Disney movie Mulan. Mulan grows up in a community that undervalues the contributions of women and has very strict expectations of femininity that Mulan struggles to live up to. When will my reflections show, she asks, who I am inside? The nation is then thrust into warfare with invading marauders, and Mulan pretends to be a male warrior to protect her father. She comes to embrace her skill, courage, and strategic value as a lateral thinking soldier. In the movie's conclusion, she is offered a position of political prominence typically reserved for men. She thereby helps her community to acknowledge the value of women outside their role as housewives. And finally, my suspicion is that this is a narrative that is implicitly embraced by many who identify as LGBT within the church. The reason why is simple. They find themselves less able to move forward in the plot-based church narrative, and so they'll cast about for other narrative templates to fill that void, to offer them some sense of future and progress to their story. And the expressive individualist template is a deeply popular, culturally preeminent story that gives new meaning to their experiences and offers them a new path forward. Unlike these others, the expressive individualist narrative is a fundamentally character-driven story. But none of these narratives are the gospel of Jesus Christ. So finally, what is the gospel narrative? In contrast to the church narrative, which is an event-driven story, the gospel narrative is a character-driven story. Like expressive individualism, it centers on the development of the protagonist into a new person. But the journey looks very different. In my version here, the journey begins as the protagonist discovers that they have been alienated from God and others through sin. They then seek to find reconciliation with God through Christ by making and keeping sacred covenants with God. And in so doing, they become new people and enjoy the fruits and gifts of the Holy Spirit in their day-to-day life as they invest themselves in their family, their community, and their church. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the narrative template at the heart of everything we teach and do in the church. The gospel, understood this way, works for everyone. It works for the same-sex attracted. It works for the mentally ill. It works for those with chronic disease. It works for the unemployed, for couples facing infertility. It works for those facing premature death. This is a universal plot that best prepares us for life's many disappointments, precisely because it cannot be derailed by the vicissitudes of life. I believe that God is far less concerned with what we do in life and far more concerned about who we become and how we are changing because of the events and choices we make. President Dallin H. Oaks taught, the final judgment is not an evaluation of the sum total of good and evil acts, what we have done. It is an acknowledgement of the final effect of our acts and thoughts, what we have become. Let's put this in terms of our earlier story template. God is not nearly so concerned with what we do for a job, than the kind of person we become as we do it. He's not nearly so concerned about whether we serve a mission as who we are or who we become while we serve, or the reasons for which we don't. The expressive individualist narrative template and the gospel narrative template both center on changes undergone by the individual. In the expressive individualist narrative, the protagonist break free of the constraints of his or her family, community, or faith to become the person they want to be true to the person that they want to become. they end up becoming an activist in their communities, striving to remake the norms. The call to adventure that the protagonist responds to is follow your heart. This is how the protagonist moves from one stage of his journey to the next, from being stifled by oppressive norms to personal liberation, and from there to becoming a social activist within their community. In the gospel narrative, the protagonist comes to acknowledge the ways in which they have alienated themselves from God and seek redemption through Christ. The call to adventure the protagonist responds to is to follow thou me. This is how the protagonist moves from one stage of the journey to the next, from finding themselves alienated from God to personal redemption through Christ, and a life of discipleship in which he or she enjoys the fruits of the Spirit and employs the gifts of the Spirit in their service to God. This should be the main plot of our life story. Our life can have consumerist subplots, exceptionalist subplots, even expressive individualist subplots. But the gospel narrative should always be the main plot, the centerpiece of our life story. Whether the unique details of our lives involves chronic illness, unemployment, infertility, same-sex attraction, a lackluster career, the centerpiece could always stay the same. A recognition of our separation from God, a quest for reconciliation through Christ the Lord, and feasting on the fruits and gifts of the Spirit. It's a story of personal transformation through Christ. When we find ourselves wondering whether the gospel isn't working for us because we have missed certain milestones in the plot-driven church narrative, or if we are thinking of ourselves as broken or as failures because we missed milestones in any of these narratives, we might ask if we've accidentally supplanted the gospel with secular or incomplete narrative templates as the main plot of our lives. And this is a story that we see everywhere in Scripture. For example, King Benjamin taught, "What a natural man is an enemy to God." Here we have our alienation from God, unless he putteth off the natural man and becometh a saint through the atonement of Christ the Lord. Here we have personal redemption through Christ. And becometh as a child, submissive, meek, humble, patient, full of love. Here we have the fruits of the Spirit, willing to submit to all things which the Lord seeth fit to inflict upon him. As a final note, I'm going to close by talking briefly about another narrative template that many of us are familiar with. This is a traditional rendition of the plan of salvation that we use within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I like to call this the places view of the plan of salvation because the focus is on where we are at any given point in time. It's a geographic map of sorts, mapping out in time and space where we are going, and the changing set pieces and major events of our life screenplay. But I'm going to make a bold claim. This is a plot-driven rendition of what is fundamentally a character-driven story. My friend Nathan Richardson has demonstrated that there is no place in Scripture where this is laid out in its entirety. And when the Scriptures do talk about the plan of salvation, they talk about it in very different terms. I don't have time today to go through all these Scriptures because there's many examples, but here's just one of them. When Ammon began to teach King Lamoni, he laid out a story that took place in 3 stages: the creation, the fall, and redemption through Christ. We read, when Ammon had said these words, he began at the creation of the world and also the creation of Adam and told him all things concerning the fall of man. But this is not all, for he expounded unto them the plan of redemption, which was prepared from the foundation of the world. Elder Bruce R. McConkie referred to these as the 3 pillars of eternity. Here is what my friend Nathan and I refer to as the conditions view of the plan of salvation, or what we might think of as a character-driven rendition of the same story. First, we are created when we find ourselves innocent in the presence of God. Then we alienate ourselves from God through sin and transgression. And then, through Christ, we embark on a journey back to God. And that journey can take place in stages. As we cleanse our hearts from sin, we move from a telestial way of life into a terrestrial way of life. As we work to consecrate ourselves to God, we move from there onto a celestial way of life. We call this the conditions view of the plan of salvation. The major question of the story is, what is the state of my soul at each stage along this journey? What am I becoming through this process? This is a fundamentally character-driven story. We are innocent, we are fallen, and then we are at various paths along the journey of redemption. Note that this is the gospel narrative, but with a little bit more resolution on the stages of our journey of redemption. We overcome telestial ways of living, and by so doing, step into a terrestrial way of living. And from there, we can learn a celestial way of life. Each stage on this journey is marked and symbolized by covenants and ordinances. And this entire story is laid out in plainness in the temple drama. And we can see here an echo of the very themes we started this presentation with, the hero's journey. In the hero's journey, we have the departure, where the hero leaves the familiar world behind. Then again, the initiation, where the hero learns to navigate the unfamiliar world. And then we have the return, where the hero returns to the familiar world. This is the story template that many refer to as the universal story, but I don't think that's quite right. It is an echo of the universal story. A universal story is encapsulated in the gospel narrative of alienation from God and reconciliation through Christ. It is a story captured in the plan of salvation, in the creation, where the realm of the innocent and familiar, the fall, a departure from that realm into the messy world in which we find ourselves put through the tests and trials of mortality, and redemption, where through Christ, we learn the art of discipleship and enjoy the gifts of the Spirit. And we look forward to our eventual return as new creatures in Christ, to be with God at home once again, but never the same. Let's go back to the beginning of our discussion today. I start out this presentation with the claim that we are co-authors of our life screenplay. What does it mean to have authorship in our life story? I believe that it means that we are moral agents, that we are not empty slates to be written on, and God cannot make us into what he wants us to be without our agentive cooperation. Our responsiveness to God and the choices that we make along the way determine the beginning, the middle, and the end of our story. But what does it mean to be a co-author? It is my belief that efforts to be the sole author of our story are the essence of damnation. The stories of the damned are precisely those stories that God did not help write, or to put another way, they're the stories about those who did not allow God to co-author their story and instead insisted on writing their own. And when we do this, we always write ourselves into a corner. Furthermore, quibbling about who is first author and who is second author is a paradigmatic example of the sort of pride and vainglory that led to Lucifer's fall. I submit that we make and keep covenants in order to take upon ourselves the name of Christ, to put his name on the cover of our book as the co-author of our story. Our story is a character-based story in which we become new creatures, fundamentally changed as people. We start the book of our life as one person, and we end it as another person. And the thing that happens in between, if we are taking up a life of discipleship, is Christ, who is the author and finisher of our story, of our faith, and the first author on all the stories of the saved. Thank you for spending some time with me today. I'd like to offer some special thanks to Ted Nasmith, who gave me special permission to use his Tolkien-based art in this presentation. In addition, if you want to be notified immediately when new content is shared, feel free to search for Latter-day Saint Philosopher page on Facebook or the Latter-day Saint Philosopher group on Facebook. In addition, you can also find me on Twitter at LDS Philosopher. And finally, I invite you to visit www.ldsphilosopher.com to explore more on all these themes and ideas. Feel free to reach out to me with your own thoughts, comments, and feedback, either on the website, in the comments below this video, on Facebook or on YouTube, or by email. Thank you very much.